Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I'm really excited to be joined by Samantha Baines. Samantha is a multi-award-winning author, actress and broadcaster. She hosts the smash hit podcast, The Divorce Social, and as a hearing aid wearer herself, she is author of critically acclaimed children's books with deaf main characters. You may recognise her from her appearances on ITV's Loose Women, Sky News, Andrew Neil's This Week, or acting roles in Netflix The Crown, Call the Midwife, Silent Witness, and Magic Mike Live, directed by Channing Tatum. She is a regular on BBC radio stations as well. Hi, Samantha. How are you?
Hello. Thank you for my lovely intro.
Oh, it's brilliant. I'm very, very excited to have you on here. Now, the podcast is all about SEND, special education needs and disabilities, but my lovely loyal listeners have been listening for over a year now, so I think they're loyal enough to let me go off piece for a little bit, just because The Crown and Called Midwife are two of my favourite TV programmes, so I need to ask you about this first and get all of my Crown stuff out of the way. So what were your parts? I actually know, I think I'm right, in Call the Midwife, were you the one who had the cough? Is that right? There was a character.
That's The Crown.
In The Crown, were you the one with the cough? Yes.
Yes. In series 1, I played Mary, a Cockney lady. I think I was the only Cockney person in the whole of series 1, like non-royal. And it was the smog episode when the smog descends on London and there's low visibility. And so I was Venetia, Churchill's secretary's housemate. And I got very ill in the smog, and she was worried about me and had to take me to hospital. And
yeah, because weren't you lying down saying you were fine? And it was clear. I remember watching, thinking she's clearly not okay. That woman really needs to be going to see somebody.
It starts with I'm like, I'm on a night out. I'm off. See you later. All sassy. And then I get progressively more ill during the episode and look horrific by the end on a hospital gurney.
And there's all those people with beautiful costumes, and you're in the crowd, and you're getting to play the one with the cough.
Yeah, grey makeup, like looking on death's door. I never play characters where I look just like a normal lady. I'm always like dying, or like a really extreme character wearing interesting clothes.
That's so funny. So if we go on to the proper podcast stuff now, I'm keen to make sure I use the correct terminology. You're a hearing aid wearer yourself. So tell me your background then about hearing loss. I read that you found out you had hearing loss when you were age 30. Is that correct? Which is quite late for someone to find out.
Yeah, well, I found out when I was 29.
Right.
And then I got my hearing aid when I was 30.
Okay.
So it was a long process because, I've written about a lot of it in my new book, but when I was born, they didn't have the newborn hearing test.
Oh, wow.
Because it came in the 1990s, like the mid 1990s. So I was sent home normally after I was born. And then I had some hearing difficulties, and we went to the doctor and they said I had glue ear.
Mm-hmm.
So I had grommets put into my ears, and it wasn't until I was 29 that I discovered that grommets are basically just a small plastic tube that goes in your ear to drain off the fluid. But in my childhood brain, because I think I was like 9 or something at the time, I thought grommets were hearing aids already. Wow. So I thought, I've had an operation, I've had hearing aids put in my ears. So when my tinnitus started at a really young age, I never told anyone about it or mentioned it or knew it was tinnitus. I used to hear a high-pitched beep, and I just assumed that's the grommets, my hearing aids working. Wow. Even though grommets are just a tube.
Yeah.
That's what I always assumed. And it wasn't until, I went to the doctor about a second type of tinnitus, which was brought on by loud noises, and it's kind of like a wavering wind noise. I call it my spider tinnitus because I know this sounds like a joke and I'm a comedian, but I honestly thought there was something living in my
Oh
ear
my goodness.
because when I was near kind of loud noises, like someone shouting or close to a speaker or something at like an event or a club, I'd hear this noise like wind moving, or I imagined a spider like scrambling around in my ear to be
Like
like, oh,
moving
that's too
away from the
loud.
sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
So I genuinely went to my GP. I've definitely watched too many of those like YouTube videos where it's like, and she had a whole family of insects living inside her. But I went to my GP and I was like, is there anything living in my ear? And I mean, bless her, she was so nice to me.
Oh,
She
that's
was
good.
really understanding. She looked in my ear, and she was like, there's nothing living in there for
No
you.
spiders.
But she also didn't say that it was tinnitus at the time,
Right.
because I thought tinnitus was just one noise, like a ringing noise, like you see
Yeah.
on TV after people have like an accident or in an explosion or something. So I didn't know that tinnitus could be loads of different types of noises. It's basically any noise you can hear inside your head that other people can't hear.
Wow. No, I didn't know that either. I kind of presume, because everyone I've spoken to who's got tinnitus has said it's like a sort of a ringing sound. So I just presume that was the same for everyone. But is it for you? It's a whooshing sound, or like that spider running
Yeah,
around,
so I
something
have the
different?
whooshing sound and I have a high pitched beep, but
Oh
it can
wow.
be, you can hear white noise, you can hear your heartbeat, you
Oh my
can hear
goodness.
like lots of different pitches of sounds. And I think, that isn't kind of widely publicized. So I had no idea this was tinnitus. And my
No.
GP then sent me for a hearing test because she was like, let's just double check nothing else is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time thinking, oh God, I don't need to go for a hearing test. Like maybe she just gets a bonus if she refers you or
A
something.
referral
So
bonus, I love
yeah, like,
it.
okay, fine, I'll go. But
Get you extra money.
yeah, but I had no idea. And now looking back, I'm like, there were lots of things that I couldn't hear and I was managing and
Yeah.
getting by and struggling, but I just thought everyone did that.
So
So
do
it
you think
wasn't
you
until
had it since you were a kid then, but just hadn't realised?
I think so, yeah, because there were definitely occasions, like at school, I always used to sit at the front and everyone would call me like a goody two shoes. And to be fair, I do like to be the teacher's favorite. Like that
Yeah.
is a personality trait as well. But, it could have been so I could lip read.
Yeah.
There were lots of things that I missed. And, obviously I'm a comedian and performer, so I'm quite confident in those arenas, but I'm not always confident in social situations. I have anxiety and I used to really hate, and still do, obviously, like big crowded situations if I'm in the middle of a crowd or
Yeah.
basically loud environments where the sound is overwhelming.
Yeah, of
And I never
course.
liked talking to people on the phone, like when my mum would be like, ring up the takeaway of a Friday
Oh.
and order our special treat. I'd hate ringing up.
Yeah.
And I just thought I just didn't like speaking to people on the phone, but it was because I struggled so much not being able to see and lip read. So yeah, I definitely think it was going on much longer. But there I was, age 29, been sent for a hearing test that I thought was just so my GP could get a bonus, which is not a thing. So when they said you have hearing loss in both ears,
Yeah.
but it's extreme enough on one side that we think you'd benefit from a hearing aid, it was a complete shock.
Wow, I really weren't expecting it. And
No.
what was the actual hearing test like? Like what actually happens in a hearing test?
Yeah, so this is what people always say. And for my book, I've interviewed like audiologists, and apparently
Oh,
we should
cool.
be getting regular hearing tests,
Oh,
like
wow.
we get regular eye tests,
Yeah.
but we don't do that at all.
I don't think I've had my hearing ever test, like I presume I can. But yeah, that's really interesting. We don't get it regularly checked at all, do we?
No, and a lot of people say that I speak to that they've never had a hearing test and can be quite scared of a hearing
Yeah.
test of like what happens. It's very easy and straightforward. It's easier than an eye test actually, because at an eye test you get that puff of air
Yeah.
squirted in your eye. And so you're always like, oh, I don't like that bit. There's nothing like that. No one squirts anything in your ear for an hearing test. You go along and you're either put in a like a small cubicle, or you'll be in a sound dampened room sitting with the audiologist. You're basically either given a little clicker like the people on the weather use, or you just put your hand up and they'll put headphones over you and play you noises like beeps. And so when you hear something, you either put your hand up or click the clicker. And then as the test progresses, they might play people speaking and then people speaking over background noise. And then you just repeat the words that you can hear. So it's
cool.
very straightforward. It's actually quite fun. Like, I got really competitive about it before
Like,
I
challenge
knew.
yourself.
Yeah, before I knew that I had hearing loss and I was deaf, I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna nail this because I'm really competitive. And so I imagined at the end of my first hearing test that they were going to be like, wow, you've done so brilliantly. We're gonna engrave your name on a board now because you're our
Here is your
highest
medal.
achiever. Yeah. And they were actually like, you need a hearing aid.
Wow,
So
but I
it
suppose
wasn't.
you wouldn't know that you didn't hear it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't know because you couldn't hear the sound, so you wouldn't know that you weren't doing very well. You'd be thinking you were doing great, and there'd be no way of knowing.
Yeah, that's how I always explain it to people. You can't hear what you can't hear, which sounds
No,
straightforward.
but
But
I
in
get
an
it.
eye test, you can see what you can't see
Mm,
because you're like, well, that bottom row is blurry. I can't
yeah.
read that. So it's an interesting one because yeah, it can come as a complete shock.
Yeah, gosh. And so the tinnitus, what sort of impact does that have on your life? Like, having that, and do the hearing aids help with the tinnitus, or is that separate?
So I only have one hearing aid, so I
Yeah.
just wear it on my right ear. So yeah, my hearing aid helps with the tinnitus brought on by loud noises because
Yeah.
it helps control the level of noise going into my ear. But my other tinnitus, which is a high pitched beep, is there all the time. So it's there now.
Wow. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
So sometimes you manage to ignore it, and you sort of forget about it. And then other times it can be brought on by like stress and caffeine and stuff like that. So other times it can get really loud and sometimes be like all you can hear. So
Oh
you
wow.
can imagine if you're in an environment where you need to be paying attention for whatever reason, and then all you can hear is this high pitched beep. It's really distracting, and it means that doing whatever you're meant to be doing can be really difficult.
Gosh.
And a lot of people really do suffer with tinnitus. And I don't use the language of suffering with deafness and hearing loss because I actually love being deaf and I love my hearing aid. But I do use the language of suffering with tinnitus because as a whole
Yeah.
of the tinnitus community that I've spoken to, people really do feel like that they're suffering with it, and there's
Yeah.
no, there just hasn't been a lot of research done with it. And I was ambassador for the British Tinnitus Association for a while. And, we went to the House of Commons and spoke to MPs, but there was a real lack of funding in tinnitus research and even like awareness of,
Yeah.
most people don't know there's different sounds within tinnitus. And there really isn't kind of a relief, or there's no pill that you can take
Yeah.
or no exercise you can do that will make your tinnitus go away. It's something that's
Gosh.
there forever.
That's horrific. That's really bad, isn't it? There's nothing else. Is there anything you can do? So no medication, no cure for it, but is there anything you found that helps sort of quieten it down for you?
Yeah, so there's things like it's brought on by stress, but don't be stressed is very easy to say, very hard
Yeah.
to do. Um,
Yeah.
if it's particularly bad, not drinking caffeinated things or eating them. And then also what I find really useful is it can be particularly loud, like right before you go to sleep, because obviously it's a quiet time. And then you're just left alone with your
Oh
thoughts
my
and
goodness. And the
a
loud
really loud
sound.
noise.
Gosh.
So playing, white noise, or I play beach sounds, when it's particularly bad to go to sleep. And also if you're kind of in a quiet environment and you're working, playing those sorts of background noises can actually help with your tinnitus because it'll drown it out. But
Yeah.
interestingly, that doesn't help me with my deafness because background noises make it harder for me to hear.
Oh
So
goodness.
it's a kind of,
Yeah,
yeah,
like a balance between
difficult.
the two. You've almost in some circumstances got to choose which one you'd prefer not to be having problems with. That's really hard. And so your hearing aid, what were your thoughts when you were told that you needed to wear one? Were they, because you say you're really positive about it now, were you always positive? Did you just embrace it straight away, or did you find it difficult?
No, I mean, there's a big chapter in my book about how I cried in a
Oh gosh.
Westfield bike shed, like where people store their bikes, because
Oh,
my audiologist was near Westfield. I didn't just like go
you
to the
just go
shopping
there as a
centre
specific place to go when you're
to
sad.
cry. Although shopping centres are a great place to cry. Because lots of other people are crying, just because of the sizes in H&M, for example. But yeah, I was walking back to the tube and it just sort of hit me and
Mm.
I just started sobbing,
Oh
and then I tried
gosh.
to find somewhere quiet, and it was this bike shed, and then at one point a woman walked in, saw me crying, and just backed away,
Oh,
which is such a British reaction to someone crying.
it
But
really is like, I don't feel uncomfortable with this.
yeah,
I'm just gonna move.
I am not getting involved with this. But yeah, it was a real shock, and I was, about to turn 30. My dad had just died.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry.
And I was feeling really like, oh my God, another thing for me
Yeah.
to deal with. And I felt like it was going to change everything, my career. I was, we talked about Call the Midwife and The Crown. Like, I was in period dramas at the time, and I thought, well, I can't wear a hearing aid in period
Oh, of
dramas.
course. Yeah.
And I was doing radio, and I was like, can you be deaf on the radio? Is that
Yeah.
allowed? And so I really thought, my career was going to be over. I thought my life was going to change for the worst. I thought I was old before my time. I thought there
Oh
was no one else like me of my age getting a hearing aid, because I'd never met anyone.
no,
Um,
that's a good point as well. Not many people do talk about it, do they? You don't hear. Yeah.
and it's interesting talking about it now, because so many people, if I open up about it, are like, oh, I have hearing aids. And like, there was someone that I've known for years, and I had no idea, and then she was like,
Wow.
yeah, I have hearing aids too. And I was like, wow, like, just opening up about it can really like make connections. But my mum has hearing aids, and she'd had them, since she was about 50. But to me, it was like she never talked about them. And it's interesting that, me starting to open up, and I became an ambassador for RNID, and started writing books with deaf characters, and my latest book, which is just like a guide to hearing loss and deafness. It's sort of made my mum talk about it more, and we've had actual conversations about it, and like she's told her work about it, and been able to kind of open up about it a little bit more.
Oh,
So
that's
it's
lovely.
because it can be hereditary,
Right. And do you think
deafness.
is your deafness hereditary, do you think, or is it not possible to know?
So so it's interesting. So a lot of the time with deafness and hearing loss later in life, you might never know why you're deaf.
Mhm.
So lots of people are born deaf. Lots of people are born deaf to deaf families, and there's a real like hereditary kind of deafness in that way. And there's an incredible deaf culture, and they'll, BSL users, and lots of deaf traditions, which is amazing within the deaf community. Other people are born with full hearing, and we know that now with the newborn hearing
Yeah.
test from the 90s, and then might lose some hearing over time, and that can be for a number of reasons. So there's a chapter in the book of, causes,
Yeah.
and so there's loads of different causes. One of them can be noise exposure,
Wow.
and a lot of the time you won't know. So unless it's a big event, like if you have your eardrum perforated, for
Yeah.
example, or if you have cancer, some of the medicines that you take because of cancer can cause hearing loss and deafness.
Wow. I didn't know that either.
So unless you sort of know because you
Yeah.
have a marker, a lot of the time it's very difficult to tell. So mine could be partly hereditary and partly due to noise damage.
Yeah.
And you can tell if there's a little bit of noise damage from the audiologist I interviewed, because the hairs inside your ear might be damaged, and that's how the sound receptors can be damaged. So I don't know. Basically, it could be noise exposure, it could be hereditary, it could be something else.
Yeah, or a bit of both. Or what advice, so you sort of embrace now your hearing aid, which is fantastic, and your deafness. What advice, because a lot of our listeners are sort of teachers of children with special educational needs, what advice would you give to any teachers supporting children with hearing aids, perhaps getting a new hearing aid, coming into the classroom feeling a little bit nervous about wearing one? What advice would you give to teachers and parents perhaps on supporting a child with a new hearing aid, or a hearing aid that's new to them?
Yeah, I think there are so many things you can do in the classroom to make that child's life and learning experience easier.
Yeah.
And so one of the main things is, if they've just got a hearing aid, presumably they've had hearing issues for a while. So they might have been struggling in class, or they might not have been. You might not have noticed anything different. But if they've had that hearing loss for a while, they might have already been relying on lip reading without knowing they are.
Yeah.
So if you can have them closer to you so they can lip read you without signaling them out, without going, Adrian has a new hearing aid, so he's going to sit at the front now, because
that's not a good idea.
No, but if you're, if you rearrange the class seating, and
just so
Adrian
happens
to be at the front so he can lip read. Also, bearing in mind that if you're turning to write on the board and you're speaking at the same time, Adrian, I love that we've created Adrian.
I can see Adrian. He's sat at the front, isn't he?
I love Adrian. He's lovely. Adrian's not going to be able to see your mouth moving if you're talking, not facing him. Also, things like with lip reading, if you're backlit, so if you're standing in front of a window and talking, he won't be able to see your lips because your face will be dark because you're lit from behind. So
really, I hadn't thought of that one. That's a really good point, especially lots of primary school classrooms, lovely and airy,
have
with
a big old window,
big windows at the side. And if you stood there, and often you are stood with the classroom with the lights behind you. So gosh.
Yeah, so making sure the light in your classroom is good, so they can see your face, and also lip read, so facing them as much as possible. Also, deaf children will quite, because there's been studies done that in GCSE levels, deaf children have received grades a whole grade lower in their GCSE 7 years in a row to children who aren't deaf. So there's definitely a lot that we can do, and I know, a lot of teachers will be like, oh, I'm trying so hard and I'm trying for everyone, but there's a lot of free things that you can do. So these are the things that I'm talking about as well, that just will be a slight kind of, in your head you just need to think, oh, I just don't stand in front of the window, as opposed to like taking a training course. I mean, obviously taking deaf awareness courses if you have a deaf child in your class, but also really the whole school should be, and all the staff should be taking deaf awareness courses, whether or not there's deaf children at your school, but especially if there's deaf children at school. But so those lip reading things of good lighting, facing the child, also arranging the seating so that the child can see other children talking to them. So if you're sitting in rows facing the front, it's really hard to lip read if all your friends are in a line next to you. So creating seating that is in a U shape, kind of rounder, is going to be so much more useful for lip reading, and also just generally for communication.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Honestly, I would have, when you were saying about Adrian, our little friend, when you were saying about him sitting at the front, I was imagining, okay, so you probably do rows so they could see, so he would be like, could fixate on the teacher easier. But you're right, you're not just learning from the teacher, right? You've got to listen to your peers, you've got to listen to people putting their hands up and talking as well, and then you're making that difficult. So I've learned something. I wouldn't have thought to have arranged the classroom in that way, so that's really useful.
And a lot of deaf schools will arrange their classrooms in a different way for that reason. So it's good to kind of, if you have other friends who are teachers and, for example, they work in a deaf school, learn from them, because they're doing it every day. And then also making the classroom acoustically pleasant, I call it in my book.
I was going to ask about this, about making it sort of acoustically nice.
Yeah, because so background noise, if you have a hearing aid, and obviously if you're profoundly deaf, or not obviously, if you're profoundly deaf, a lot of the time you'll have learnt sign language, BSL. So BSL stands for British Sign Language. There's also ASL, American Sign Language, ISL, Irish Sign Language. So, but British is what we use in this country. A lot of the time that child will speak using British Sign Language, or especially if they come from a deaf family, they'll use British Sign Language in the home. Now, I think deaf children should always learn British Sign Language, because so it used to be the way in kind of medicine and educational settings that children were taught, or parents were told, not to introduce British Sign Language to their deaf child because it would stop their language development. And recent studies have shown that it's the other way around, because your motor skills develop before your speech does. So actually, if you learn sign language from a baby, you can start communicating with signs before your language develops. And there's also finger spelling, which is what we use to spell out the alphabet. That also helps with learning how to spell words. And there's actually so many benefits to using sign language alongside oral speech if the child speaks orally. So sign language is really important. And also, as a deaf person, it's so relaxing. So I was never taught sign language when I was younger. So I started on my deaf journey. I thought sign language wasn't for me. Like, I wasn't allowed to use it because, I'd always been hearing it before that. And then I just got this hearing aid. And I've started to learn sign language since I got my hearing aid. And it's amazing. And as a deaf person, it's like, well, for me, it's such a relief when I can use sign language, because there's something called concentration fatigue, and this is really high in children as well. And I talk about this in the book. So deaf children with a hearing aid or without are constantly trying to understand an ableist world around them and an audist world around them, which is, a sound-based world. So they are constantly trying to listen, trying to lip read, trying to understand what's going on, because it's not accessible for them. So you can imagine, like, they're also growing, socializing with their peers, trying to learn. And on top of that, so they can be so tired at the end of the day. And as an adult, my concentration fatigue can be so high, even if I just go to like an event. In my industry, there's lots of events that I have to go to as part of my job. And if I go to an event and there's a lot of background noise, and the whole evening I'm trying to listen to people, trying to lip read, trying to respond, trying to not seem rude, because when you're trying to lip read, your face isn't necessarily smiling. It's like a concentration face, and then people think you're mean. So there's all of this, and then the next day I'll be so tired that I have to like sleep in late and really take it easy. So you can imagine, for a deaf child at school, it can be so tiring.
It must be absolutely exhausting. I'm just trying to imagine doing all of that on top of your learning and on top of all the socialness at school. That's that's really hard.
So if there is any sign language you can learn, I think as a teacher, or having an interpreter in class for the child, it does make such a difference, because it's so relaxing to use sign language because you don't have to try and listen. So that makes a really big difference. And obviously you can learn sign language if you get the funding and stuff, but there's also a lot of deaf creators on social media, for example, and it is really important to find a deaf creator. So someone who is a native BSL user or a teacher of BSL that's doing sign language. So Signature, the charity, they are the accreditation of like sign language courses that you can take. On their social media, they teach signs as well. So even just learning little bits like that from Signature, because there are a lot of hearing people on the internet that also try and teach signs. But the issue with that is they're not a native BSL user. They're not an accredited teacher. They might some of them are even teaching Makaton, which is a completely different language to BSL, even though some of the signs are similar. It's like the difference between French and English. The root of the words of French and English might come from the same thing, but they're still a different language. So a lot of them are kind of spreading false information. So don't get on board with them. Get on board with like Signature, a trusted source, and just learn a few signs can really make a deaf child welcome in your class. But also, as I spoke about concentration fatigue and background noise, having a little breakout space, not just useful for deaf children, but also children who might get sensory overload or whatever it is, who just need a moment sometimes in a small, quiet environment, creating that nook in the corner of a classroom where they can just go and have a little breather. Also, making the classroom acoustically pleasant, as I said before.
So how do you do that then? What's the best way of making a classroom acoustically pleasant? I love that phrase. I'm going to use that.
I know.
Acoustically pleasant.
Because there's not really like a phrase for it. It's just like add some padding. So I like acoustically pleasant. So things that absorb sound are soft furnishings. Basically. Things that bounce sound off are like clean, flat, solid, shiny surfaces. So windows, not good. Walls with no kind of insulation or padding in them also bounce sound off. High ceilings bounce sound off. So that means that any background noise within your classroom is going to be bouncing around for everyone, and any noise from the outside as well that's going to be bleeding into your classroom. So really useful things are curtains.
Genius.
So obviously if it's a really sunny day and the sun's shining in through the window and causing you to be backlit, you can pull those curtains, and not only will they regulate the light, it'll also add some sound dampening. And even just having the curtains there but open is going to absorb some of the sound too. Cushions are great. So in your little nook that is a quiet space for them to go to, having loads of cushions and make it feel really comfy. If there are seats in the classroom, those seats with cushioned padding are not only more comfortable, they also help absorb sound. Human bodies help absorb sound. So knowing that if you're having a one-to-one with a student in a larger classroom, the sound's going to bounce around more than if there were 30 children in that classroom. And then also you can do like fun things like, creating draping across the ceiling if you have high ceilings that will absorb the sound. Things like, curtained off areas, plants, like any little padded walls. So having one of those padded kind of wheelie boards that you can then pin pictures that they've drawn to or whatever. That's a really good way to not only like segment the space but also provide acoustic padding. And as I said, you can have fun with it. So you can be like, we're designing some curtains today. So just get like some old sheets and some fabric pens, and everyone gets to like draw something. Maybe you could theme it around what you're learning that term. Maybe it's space or plants and photosynthesis, whatever it is, and have fun with it. And then it's like, oh look, we've created these curtains or this panel that's going to go on the ceiling or whatever it is.
They've got some ownership over it. When you were describing about like the padding and the cushions and all of that, I almost felt like you were describing how I've set up my podcast today, because that's exactly the same thing, isn't it? I've got cushions. I'm not going to show people because it's embarrassing, but I've got cushions around here to absorb the sound, and it's the same thing. If I just recorded it in here with all the walls being quite hard, it would bounce off and the sound quality would be awful. So it's the same sort of way you've got to plan anything with sound, isn't it? You've got to make it so it absorbs the sound rather than echoes and bounces off.
And it makes such a difference. If you're in a room where lots of people are talking and you're trying to listen to one person, like the teacher, even if someone like, if I was sitting and listening to someone giving a speech and someone behind me was whispering, all I'd be able to hear is the person behind me whispering and not the person giving a speech. So, it's and obviously there's lots of different levels and experiences of hearing loss and deafness
Yeah.
within the whole group of what deaf is and means. But yeah, so just taking those things into consideration, and these are all fairly cheap things,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, like
definitely.
you can get cushions from a charity shop, or get,
Yeah,
you know, parents to bring in
yeah,
old cushions they don't want anymore, can really make a difference. And then learning a few signs, and maybe having a deaf person, a local deaf person. There's lots of local deaf support groups around the
yeah,
country. So, you know, maybe asking them if they can come in and teach some signs, or
yeah.
their local deaf tutor. And also, you know, deaf authors. Hello.
Do you know
Coming in.
any?
Oh, well, it just so happens that I am one, and I write books with deaf protagonists, you know, coming in. And I think role models are really important as
Yeah,
well.
me
So
too.
having, you know, letting children in your class, whether they're hearing or deaf, meet deaf people, deaf adults, deaf teenagers, and having deaf members of staff is
Yeah,
super
very good
important
point.
as well, and
Because
championing that within your kind of school and learning environment.
yeah, because it's not rare as well, is it? Hearing loss or deafness. It's not like I read, I think it was your article in the Huff Post, 1 in 6 people, is that right?
It's
Have
now 1 in 5. So
no, 1 in 5, gosh.
12 million people in the
In the
UK
UK, gosh.
have some form of hearing loss or deafness.
Well, I had when I read it, because I was doing my research for you, and I read that, and I was like, 1 in 6 people. And I actually stopped my husband because he was walking past getting a cup of tea, and I was like, "Did you know 1 in 6 people have some sort of hearing loss or deafness?" And he couldn't believe it either. And we were both really, really shocked about it, because you, I don't feel like I know people, and that sort of surprises me. But like you say, I must know people, but I'm not aware that I know people, and I feel bad about that. That I haven't sort of, yeah, yeah. It shocked me. So there's
And
going to be people, and there's going to be children in lots of classrooms across the country who have got hearing loss.
yeah, and also I think, and lots of teachers.
Yeah,
And also I think it's really important to create that environment wherever you work, where people can be open about
yeah,
it and can put that, you know, because it's a really scary and brave thing to put your hand up and go, actually, yeah, I have hearing loss, I have
yeah,
hearing aids. Or because, you know, in the work, I know I talk about it a lot and write books about it, but originally I was so scared that people were going to assume that I wouldn't be able to do my job, and people do still assume that, you know.
oh
I
gosh.
was on the radio, a big radio station recently, and I was in the studio, and the producer asked me if my hearing aid was going to interfere with the equipment, and it doesn't.
No,
But, you know, and obviously they wouldn't want to put me on air, or they'd want to take my hearing aid out if that was the case. And people, you know, I think it's something like deaf people are twice as likely, the stats in the book, to be unemployed as hearing people.
oh my goodness,
Um,
gosh.
it might even be 4 times.
I have to get Samantha's book to find out. I like this. It's like you're tempting people.
Yeah, but we're definitely a lot more likely than hearing people to be
Yeah,
unemployed, and a lot of that is down to inaccessible work environments,
yeah,
and also the fact that because someone's deaf, you know, some people might assume that they can't do their job, and actually we can,
yeah,
and we have extra skills that
yeah,
enable us
yeah.
to do our job even better. You know, I interviewed a teacher for my book, and she's also set up a um, deaf community group for children and parents.
Brilliant.
And she says that when she works with children, they know that they've got her full attention because she's a BSL user. And so and BSL is all about kind of looking at the other person and their body language and reading their emotions and reading their signs. And there have been studies that deaf people are better drivers because our perception and peripheral vision is so much better because we
Wow.
rely on it more. So you can imagine, like, in a school environment, you know, working with a big group of children, that's such a useful skill to have.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I interviewed a deaf nurse, and people always assume that she can't do her job. And actually, she says she has the skills to notice things that other people don't notice because they rely on
Yeah,
sound. So, you know, creating an environment where deaf people feel welcome, and
yeah,
also creating an environment where you just say, what are your access needs?
yeah.
all the time to your staff, is there anything I can do? You know, are there any access needs that you have? Is there anything I can do to make life easier? And opening up, you know, if you have any access needs yourself or you're deaf, creates that environment where people feel like they can talk about it and be open about it. And that will
absolutely.
bleed through to obviously the children and the learning environment as well.
Yeah, and another way we can make deaf children feel more included is through children's books, which nicely brings me on to ask questions about your fantastic children's books that you've written. So you've written 2 children's books so far, and you've written your other book that's aimed at adults, which has just come out as well. But if we start with your first one, which is called Harriet versus the Galaxy, and that one has the young protagonist bolstered by her disability, and she has hearing aids. She's called Harriet, and it doesn't hold her back. And doesn't it translate alien languages or something to save the world? Can you tell us about this book? Because it sounds fantastic. I need to go and get a copy.
Yeah, so Harriet has 1 hearing aid like
Mm-hmm.
me, and her hearing aid translates alien languages, and her gran protect the earth from aliens called the Munchers. So the Munchers are aliens who eat stuff. So if you've ever lost a sock, it's because of sock muncher. And if you've ever lost a pen, it's because of pen muncher. And there's even knicker muncher who eats Gran's knickers off her bottom at one point during the book, which is quite shocking for Gran.
But hilarious for children. I imagine they find that
yes.
really, really funny. That's
you know,
kids'
knickers.
humour.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
There's some, you know, there's alien planets that I've created in the book, which is one of the most fun things to do. And there's a planet called Rombaddy Bum Bum, which is usually a favorite for the children, and also just rolls off the tongue very nicely. And the Rombaddies are aliens with 2 bottoms, one for talking and one for farting, and the farting helps them move around the planet. So
very logical. I like it.
Classic. So yeah, it's very silly. There's lots of jokes in there, but Harriet goes on kind of this adventure. She's had to move to her gran's house because her dad works in a van. He's driving all around the country. Her mum's not in the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so she starts living with Gran. She meets her next door neighbor, Robin, who's a non-binary child. And starts to become friends with Robin, and then discovers that Gran is a secret astronaut spy.
No.
has been protecting the earth from aliens since she was 11.
No way.
And now, you know, Harriet and Robin gets roped in as well, and their new best friend Sock Muncher, who's one of the nicer munchers.
This sounds brilliant. I'm going to buy it. It sounds fantastic. It really, really does. It sounds really funny as well. I love that. And I'm right in saying that her hearing aid isn't sort of central to the plot. It's more sort of, obviously the bit where she can hear the aliens, but it's more sort of incidental, is it, that she's got a hearing aid?
Well, it's an adventure book at its heart. So her hearing aid is like brings an extra skill, which is translating alien languages. But she's just a very brave, you know, sassy girl who's protecting the earth with her gran. And it's about her relationship with her gran, her relationship missing her dad, her relationship with this new friend, Robin. And also, you know, a little bit about her hearing aid and how she got it. And there, you know, it's mentioned that she was bullied at her old school a little bit for her hearing aid and how she felt about that. So there definitely is the kind of that through line, but it's not a book about a little girl getting a hearing aid.
Yes.
It's an adventure book, and her hearing aid's a bonus.
I love that. So your second book, The Night the Moon Went Out, again, the main character in that one has a hearing aid as well, and she's scared of the dark. Can you tell us a bit more about that book?
Yeah, so this is Anira, which I actually named after my friend's little girl. They had a little girl called her Anira. So Anira has 2 hearing aids, and she takes them out at night to charge them, as I do. And it makes the dark even scarier, because I've always been scared of the dark, right, since I was little. And it wasn't until I thought about writing this book that I was like, well, yeah, obviously, because the dark is scary because you can't see and you imagine what might be there. But if you can't see and you can't hear very well,
oh my goodness,
you don't even get any kind of notification sound wise that there might be a monster in your wardrobe. So of course it's going to be more scary. So Anira's scared of the dark. Her nightlight doesn't work one night. her mum tells her that there's a nightlight for everyone and it's the moon out of her window.
Oh.
But she doesn't want the moon. And she says that out loud and she accidentally turns the moon off.
Oh no.
So then she has to go on an adventure with the help of a talking owl, because why wouldn't you? So the owl kind of talks telepathically.
Brilliant.
And they go on an adventure to turn the moon back on.
Oh, we won't spoil it, but I hope they succeed in turning the moon back on and it's not still off. But you can't tell us the ending there.
I can't tell you the ending.
So you obviously think representation in books for children, especially with children with special educational needs and disabilities, is really important. Why is that? Why are you so passionate? Why did you write these books?
Well, first of all, I never thought I could be an author, because I think when I was growing up, my idea of authors were like old white posh men. And that wasn't me. I know I sound quite posh, but I've had drama training, darling. I'm from Bromley. I'm a Bromley girl. So I never thought I'd be able to write a book. And then it wasn't until, it's funny, my mum was always like, you're so good at writing, you should write a book. And I'd obviously written stand-up and journalism and stuff, but it wasn't sort of it was never like a career goal.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I got my hearing aid and then I started learning about being deaf and the deaf culture, and became an ambassador for RNID and started doing events with them and meeting other incredible deaf people. And, that people started asking me if I could recommend any deaf books for adults or children.
Oh, wow.
And I suddenly realized I had personally never read a book with a deaf main character.
Yeah.
And I didn't even, there were some out there, but I didn't even know of them at the time, or like the titles, never heard of them. And I realized in media as well, I'd never watched a film with a deaf main character, for example. And I thought, why is that? And so then I started doing a bit of research so that I could say something to people when they were like, do you have any recommendations? And I realized there just wasn't like in the mainstream.
Wow.
And there wasn't like a collection of books. There was like 2 that I could find. So I thought, well, maybe I should write one. And actually, Living with Hearing Loss and Deafness, my new book, is the first book I wanted to write for adults.
Oh, cool.
And I didn't know anything about the book world. And I went to a book event and I spoke to some publishers and I sort of verbally pitched the idea. And, at the time, no one was interested in hearing loss and deafness and having a book or a guide about it, because they were like, well, it's really niche. 12 million people. It's
not
really
that niche.
And then I actually met a children's publisher called Knights of, and their whole remit is publishing diverse books. And they'd been working a lot with Black authors and telling incredible stories. And I was like, well, have you ever thought about doing a book with a deaf main character? And they were like, what would it be about? And I just thought of the things that I like space and like brave children and also brave girls, because I read a lot of books when I was growing up and the main character was a boy a lot of the time. So I was like, I want a brave girl who has a hearing aid. And that became Harriet versus the Galaxy. And they were like, okay, we'll go and write it and send it to us. And so it sort of happened. I call myself an accidental activist.
I love that.
Because I never intended to set out and write books with deaf characters. But after Harriet, I enjoyed it so much. And obviously one of the best things is the reaction. When I go and talk to schools and children with hearing aids, and I'm like, my hearing aid's pink, what color's yours? And they're like, it's red. And and then they're like Harriet and they dress up as Harriet for World Book Day.
That's wonderful.
And I can kind of relate to them when I go into class, and then afterwards, the rest of the class talk to them because they were like the author. And we've been talking about hearing
wonderful.
aids. And it just felt like, I feel a bit emotional. It felt like the best thing I'd ever done.
I can imagine.
And my goals were always like, be an actress in nice things, get attention. And then when I did Harriet, I was just like, oh, this is, why am I not doing this? This is wonderful. So that started it all.
That's so wonderful. And do you want to tell us a little bit more about your latest book then, Living with Hearing Loss and Deafness, A Guide to Owning It and Loving It? I love that. Owning it and loving it.
Yeah, I wanted it to feel a bit sassy.
Yeah,
it
does. I don't think you can say that, A Guide to Owning It and Loving It, without a bit of sass.
Good. Yeah, because I wanted it to be a guide, because when I got my hearing aid, I love books and I've always loved books. So one of the first things I did was try and find a book to tell me what the experience was going to be like.
I think I'd do the same. I think that's literally what I would do. I'd be the same. Right, I need to get a book on this.
Yeah, I need to get a book and do my research so I know what's coming up. And the only books I could find at the time were sort of quite dry academic books about deafness, and those books are brilliant and very important, but it wasn't what I was looking for. I was like, I need like practical tips, and also like a person like actually telling me what happened to them and
like relatable,
what to expect. And so that's what I wanted to create with Living with Hearing Loss and Deafness. And I wanted it to be a guide, but also the sass in the title is to make it clear that it's like also me having a chat with you. And I do interview experts and audiologists and other deaf people and BSL users and BSL tutors and interpreters and, all sorts of people to inform the book. And there's stats in there. But then there's also like a description of me crying in the Westfield shopping centre and like me realizing the first time I couldn't hear something and having that realization moment. And the mental health that comes along with having a hearing aid, realizing you have hearing loss, being told you have hearing loss, because in a medical setting it's quite often framed as hearing loss, and a lot of the deaf community don't like that phrase, and then sometimes people call themselves hard of hearing or deaf with a small d. And then people who might be born into a deaf family and born deaf might call themselves deaf with a capital D. But there's lots of nuances within that terminology. And, I didn't know any of that. So me learning that and the mental health repercussions of like your identity changing in the way that you thought of it before, you suddenly having an invisible disability, and this kind of new aspect of your life and what that might mean for you, and then learning to kind of love my deafness and own it. And I thought that was really important part of the book, as well as like practical things of like how to change a hearing aid battery if you have them. So I just wanted kind of to put everything in one place for people, so that if you did discover, like me, age 29, that you need a hearing aid, this is your guide. Or if you've been deaf for a long time since birth, but you want to feel seen and hear what other deaf people had to say about it, you can read the book and feel seen. And if you're kind of working in a school or working in a workplace and you have a deaf member of staff or a deaf child, you can also read the book and learn what it's like for them living as a deaf person.
It sounds absolutely fantastic. It really does. Can you give us some links then to send people? Because there might be schools thinking, oh, we'd quite like her to come into our school, please. Or there might be people...
would be very nice.
Or there might be people thinking, oh, we'd like to buy her book. So can you like send us... So you've got a website. Do you want to give us I'll put it on the show notes as well for everybody to copy it down. But if you want to tell us where people can find you and stuff, that would be useful.
Yeah. So my website is just samanthabaines.com.
That's lovely.
Baines, because sometimes people spell it strangely. And so all the links to buying books are on there, and there's also like a speaking page where it kind of says the school workshops I do. I normally do them on deaf awareness and joke writing.
Cool. Joke writing, that sounds fun.
Yes. Because also I think, again, joke writing can be something that we don't imagine that we can do, like tell jokes when we're younger, especially if you're like a bit shyer at school. Or I love encouraging girls to write jokes, or non-binary children to write jokes. So that's just a bit of fun, and then everyone gets up in front of the class and tells a joke.
I love that.
Their first stand-up gig. So yeah, all of that is on the website. And then I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, but my Instagram is not for children. So teachers are allowed to follow me, but it's restricted to over 16s.
Okay.
And then I'm on Twitter as well.
Brilliant. Oh,
Just
well,
at
thanks.
Samantha Baines.
Fabulous. Thank you ever so much. I've learned so much. Genuinely, I feel like I've learned a lot today, and I hope that I'm sure our listeners will be feeling the same. So thank you ever so much for your time.
That's okay. It's lovely. Thanks.
Wow, I don't know about you, but I've learned so much from that episode. And wasn't she a brilliant guest? Even if I messed it up at the start when I said call the midwife instead of the crown. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Have a look at the show notes and I'll pop links there to her books as well as any resources we've got that are linked to the episode. And thanks again for listening to Sending the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. Catch you again next time.